In the mid-19th century, a ghostly orange glow often danced on the decks of whaling ships far out at sea. These flickering lights came from the try-works furnaces on board, great brick hearths with iron cauldrons, where blubber was rendered into oil. It was a sight both awe-inspiring but foreboding. Awe-inspiring because it represented human enterprise, stretching its reach into the remotest oceans, but foreboding because it hinted at an industry consuming itself in pursuit of the giants of the deep. And indeed, there are few industries that have so dramatically risen to global prominence and then proceeded as swiftly as the industrial whaling of the pre-electrification era. By the time of electric light, whaling's heyday was over. Its ships had scoured every ocean, its profits had peaked and plummeted, and its impact on economies and societies was undeniable. The story of whaling's rise and fall before the advent of electricity is one of bold exploration, innovation, social upheaval, immense wealth, and eventually decline. A saga that spans continents, from the Basque coast of Spain to the icy bays of the Arctic, from New England ports to Pacific atolls. It offers insights into how economic hunger and technological change can drive a global industry to its zenith and then to its doom. Welcome to the channel. Introductions out of the way, let me welcome you. Of course, if you are new here, I'd like to invite you to hit the subscribe button, or if you've not done so yet, and leave your thoughts in the comments. It always helps. This video is 100% ad-free. The reason for this being the generous contributions of those on Patreon YouTube memberships, those who chose to donate, and those who checked out the merch store. Even out of curiosity, you'll be surprised what I have on there. So why not click that button? Now, with everything out of the way, let's get on to our topic at hand. A bit of a different one today, a departure from the usual fare of this channel, but I thought it was interesting. So, here I am. Get nice and relaxed. We're going to have a whale of a time. Well, we better start from the beginning then. Long before whaling became a globe-spanning industry, communities had been hunting whales on a smaller scale for centuries. The Basque people of the Bay of Biscay were among the pioneers. By the 12th century, they were taking right whales in coastal waters, and by the 16th, Basque whalers were regularly sailing to the rich whaling grounds of Newfoundland and Labrador. So for about 50 years in the 1500s, they prospered off the waters of eastern Canada, rendering blubber into oil on shore and filling barrels with what was then known as train oil. This early whaling laid the groundwork for techniques and trade in whale products. Basque innovations such as cutting up whales alongside ships and boiling blubber in large tripods would later be adopted and refined by others. Moving on to the 17th century, the epicenter of whale shifted to the Arctic seas. The Dutch, in particular, emerged as dominant players. Seeking an alternative route to Asia, Dutch explorers in the 1590s stumbled instead upon the teeming whale populations around Spitsbergen, also known as Svalbard. Within decades, the Dutch had turned this discovery into a thriving enterprise. They established seasonal whaling stations, such as Smeerenburg, literally Blubber Town. Probably not the best name to attract tourists. This was on Spitsbergen, the shores of this place, where the catch of the summer would then be rendered into oil, right there on the beach. During the 1600s, hundreds of Dutch ships prowled the Arctic, each year in search of bowhead and right whales, competing fiercely with the English and others. Word had spread, and the hunt was definitely on. By the late 17th and early 18th century, the Netherlands enjoyed a near monopoly in Arctic whaling, having killed an estimated 30,000 whales, and of course, raked in huge profits. Dutch whalers became so preeminent that they could effectively set high oil prices across Europe. This era saw whaling truly take on an industrial character. Significant capital was invested in fleets and onshore processing. Specialized equipment was developed, and entire towns were involved in outfitting whaling voyages. One contemporary Dutch whaling captain, Cornelis Zorgdrager, published a detailed account of the trade, documenting everything from ship provisions to hunting methods amid the ice floes. His writings attest to a sophisticated industry, one that required not just hardihood at sea, but also careful planning and knowledge of whale habits in Arctic conditions. And that is specialist knowledge. Back in those days, you had to go there and find out for yourself. You were lucky if you got back from the Arctic. Meanwhile, other European powers took up whaling in fits and starts. The English, through the Muscovy campaign, had sent whaling expeditions to Spitzbergen as early as 1611. But costly competition with the Dutch, and among English companies themselves, meant that by the late 1600s the British presence in northern whaling was quite minimal. Only when the Dutch dominance faltered in the 1690s, mainly due to wars and politics back in Holland, did the English see opportunity to re-enter the game, a power vacuum of sorts. The British Parliament began to encourage whaling as a matter of national interest. Legislators saw whaling as a way to reduce reliance on foreign oil and to build a reserve of hardy sailors and ships that would be useful in wartime. So, starting in 1733, the British government offered generous bounties for whaling vessels, essentially subsidies per ton of ship burthen to any British outfit that sent out whalers. The bounty was raised over the years, reaching 40 shillings per ton by 1750, and that effect was dramatic. In 1749, only 2 British ships went whaling, but with the higher subsidies, 20 ships were outfitted just 1 year later in 1750, and by 1756 this had raised to 83. This revival was aided by rising demand. The Industrial Revolution was well and truly underway, and whale oil greased the machines of the new age. Right whale oil was widely used to lubricate the looms of the growing textile industry, and to fuel the thousands of oil lamps that lit the streets in London and other cities. London by the 1740s boasted about 5,000 street lamps, making it perhaps the best lit city in the world. Of course, Paris was onto it a little bit before them, but, whale oil was an essential part of that illumination. British Arctic whaling, centered in ports like London, Hull, and Whitby, thus surged in the mid-18th century. It reached a peak in the 1780s, when roughly 250 British whaling vessels were active in northern waters, employing around 10,000 men. The image of dozens of British whalers working in Greenland and the Davis Strait, their decks slick with oil and their casks filled with blubber, attest how strategically important the trade had really become. And indeed, one historian later noted that, quote, "Few interests have exerted a more marked influence upon the history of the United States than that of the fisheries," a statement originally made about the American context, but certainly equally apt for Britain. and other nations worldwide. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the torch of whaling supremacy had passed to the now burgeoning United States. American colonists had been practicing shore whaling in New England since the 1600s. Nantucket's islands inhabitants, for example, took to whaling by the late 17th century, learning from both Native American techniques and borrowed knowledge from Europe. After American independence, the New England whaling towns rapidly expanded in their deep-sea whaling ventures. Nantucket and Cape Cod families, unshackled from British trade restrictions, sent ships farther afield in search of the lucrative sperm whale, whose oil was especially prized. By 1789, an American whale ship had ventured into the Pacific for the first time, the ship Beaver of Nantucket. This was a harbinger of things to come. In the early 19th century, American whaling exploded into global enterprise. The Yankee whaling ships, as they were called, roamed every ocean in pursuit of whales. First, the North and South Atlantic, then around Cape Horn into the Pacific, and even up into the Arctic Ocean. But what prompted all this? Well, several factors powered the American rise. Economically, whale products were in high demand during the first half of the 1800s. Whale oil was a pillar of lighting and lubrication of the pre-electric world. One particular variety, spermaceti oil from sperm whales, was considered the finest illuminating oil available. It burned, too, with a clear, bright flame, and very little smoke, perfect for high-quality candles and lamps. John Adams, while serving as a U.S. diplomat in the 1780s, even tried to persuade the British Prime Minister William Pitt to adopt spermaceti oil for London street lamps. In his diary, he recorded his pitch. Quote, "The fat of the spermaceti whale gives the clearest and most beautiful flame of any substance known in nature, and we are surprised that you prefer darkness and consequent robberies, burglaries, and murders in your streets to receiving as a remittance our spermaceti oil." Not a bad pitch, I must say. Well, this colorful appeal shows how proud the Americans had become of their specific brand of whale oil, and how vital they believed it was for illumination. The British remained unconvinced at the time, however. But elsewhere, demand for whale oil only grew. By the 1840s, New Bedford, Massachusetts, which had overtaken Nantucket as the leading whaling port, styled itself the city that lit the world, reflecting how its prodigious output of oil kept lamps aglow on several continents. And at the same time, baleen, also known as whalebone, became another economic driver. Now, baleen are the flexible plates in the mouths of certain whales, like right and bowhead whales, used to filter food. But in 19th century industries, baleen was a wonderful natural plastic. I know it all sounds horrible, but it is what it is, right? It was strong, yet pliable, and could be cut into thin strips or stays. Fashion and manufacturing both craved this material, and the most famous use was in women's corsets. You know, those undergarments that gave the Victorian women that hourglass figure. By the mid-1800s, advertisements for corsets proudly declared, "Real whalebone only used," as baleen stays were considered far superior to any substitutes. Whalebone was also made into umbrella ribs, collar stiffeners, whips, and even springy strips for the early typewriter mechanisms. So it's no exaggeration to say that baleen was the plastic of the 1800s. Many everyday items that we would later make out of celluloid or acrylic were first made with whalebone. Take a look around your house and use your imagination. Well, this kept the whaling fleet busy, even aside from oil. A large Greenland or bowhead whale might yield tons of baleen, along with oil, making it valuable in several different ways. Now, in terms of technology, American whalers innovated to support longer and more profitable voyages. As early as 1750, New England whalemen had begun installing try-works, brick furnaces with iron pots, directly on their ships. Now, this meant in practice that whales could be processed into oil at sea, rather than having to sail home with raw blubber all over the place. The same kind of ones that I mentioned in the introduction, by the way. Well, the other thing was that these try-works also allowed the American ships to cruise for years, ranging to the remote Pacific and filling casks with oil as they went. By the 1820s and 30s, American whale ships routinely spent 2 to 4 years on a single voyage, circling the globe in the pursuit of whales, and they became floating factories in their own right, decks blackened by oil and smoke. Observers in the Pacific and the 1830s noted how at night a successful whale ship could be spotted from miles away just by the light and smell of its try-works in full blaze, rendering the day's catch. American ingenuity also improved tools for whaling. The basic hand harpoon, essentially a barbed iron spear on a wooden shaft, had changed very little since the Basque times. It was good for making fast to a whale, but not for killing it outright. Whalers would harpoon a whale from small open boats, and then let it run and tire itself. Known as the Nantucket sleigh ride, by the way, if the whale towed the boat. Only later, when the whale was exhausted, would they approach and thrust lances into its vital organs. It was obviously quite dangerous, and many crews were smashed or drowned by whales fighting for their lives. Poor things. You gotta feel sorry for them, don't you? Anyway, in the 19th century, several innovations aimed to make whaling safer and more efficient. For the people, that is, not for the whales. In 1848, a blacksmith from New Bedford named Lewis Temple introduced the toggle harpoon, now famous as Temple's iron. It had a pivoting barb that would swing open once lodged in the whale's flesh, preventing the harpoon from slipping out. Temple's toggle dramatically improved the catch rate. A harpoon that held fast meant fewer whales would escape wounded. And notably, Temple never even patented the design. Yet within a few years, almost every single whaler in the world had adopted this superior piece of equipment. Other innovations included the introduction of shoulder guns and bomb lancers in the 1840s. They were essentially firearms that could be fired from a distance, launching an explosive lance into the whale. American whalers began using them around 1846 to dispatch whales more quickly. Devices like that, of course, being precursors to the fully mechanized whaling of the next era. The results of these economic and technological drivers were obviously quite staggering. By the 1840s, whaling had become one of the United States' largest and most lucrative industries. There were roughly 600 to 700 American whaling ships active at the peak, accounting for the majority of all whaling vessels in the world at the time. In the late 1840s, of an estimated 900 whaling ships roaming the oceans, over 700 were flying the Stars and Stripes. New Bedford alone sent out hundreds of ships a year, and together with ports like Nantucket, Sag Harbor, New London, it made US the unquestioned power in global whaling. The American fleet hunted every species it could find: sperm whales in the mid-Atlantic and Pacific, right whales in colder waters, bowheads in the Arctic, and even smaller species like humpbacks were encountered. The voyages grew ever longer as nearer hunting grounds were depleted. Yankee whalers rounded Cape Horn to find new whaling grounds in the South Pacific and Indian Ocean. By the 1820s, they were whaling off Japan, and by the 1840s, American ships ventured into the remote North Pacific and Arctic too. In 1848, the same year Temple's harpoon came into use, daring New England whalers first pushed through the Bering Strait into the Arctic Ocean to chase the bowhead whales of the Chukchi Sea. And this opened a rather complex new frontier, the Western Arctic. Over the next 2 decades, dozens of ships each summer would brave the fog and ice of Alaskan waters to harvest the enormous bowhead. Now, just to put that into perspective, a single bowhead whale could yield more than 200 barrels of oil and hundreds of pounds of baleen. One can imagine the spectacle: whaling barkentines and brigs bobbing among the ice floes in the midnight sun, while the indigenous people, the Unyupiat, on the shore watched these curious foreign vessels invade their frigid waters. But the whalers, for their part, encountered landscapes and peoples previously unknown to them. Effectively, they had become unwitting explorers. And indeed, whaling captains added significantly to geographic knowledge, mapping new islands in the Pacific and describing the Arctic coastlines, reporting on winds and currents. So by the late 1850s, the modern industrial whaling industry, still by the way conducted by wind-powered ships and hand tools, but in a very organized and capital-intensive manner, had reached what we could call its golden age. The economic impact was profound, ridiculous even. Whale products fueled lamps and lubricated machines in that era before petroleum. Baleen undergirded fashions and consumer goods. And in New England, whole towns prospered from whaling. New Bedford was said to have the highest per capita income of any city in America around the mid-century, wealth built on bone and oil. And globally, whaling was one of the first truly worldwide industries. Whale ships from America, France, Britain, few other nations, ranged over the entire globe, making ports of call in places as far-flung as Hawaii, Tahiti, and Madagascar, even New Zealand. They forged early economic links. For instance, Hawaiian ports like Honolulu and Lahaina, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, became booming provisioning stations for whalers by the 1830s, bringing significant commerce to the Hawaiian kingdom. In 1819, the first New England whalers arrived in Hawaii, and soon hundreds of ships a year were reprovisioning there. Now this activity affected the local societies. Hawaiian villagers saw the arrival of rowdy crews and new goods. Some native Hawaiians even joined up with the whaling voyagers. The cosmopolitan makeup of the whaling crews was another notable social aspect of the industry. While many officers hailed from New England seafaring families, the forecastle, the crew's quarters, was a melting pot of different people. Men from all over the world ended up on American whale ships. Cape Verdeans, Azorians from the Atlantic Islands, African Americans, including some formerly enslaved men, seeking now a life at sea, Pacific Islanders, and New England Native Americans. It was said that a whaling ship's crew might speak a dozen languages among them. But, as interesting as it wasn't glamorous. Life aboard was brutal and adventurous in equal measure. Whalers routinely launched small open boats to chase 50-ton whales, facing the possibility of being smashed by a giant tail. Then there were the storms, the shipwrecks, the disease, and even starvation, all occupational hazards on a multi-year voyage. So it's probably not too surprising that whaling generated harrowing tales that filtered back into popular culture. The most famous of these is the saga of the whale ship Essex of Nantucket. In 1820, the Essex was struck and sunk by an enraged sperm whale in the remote South Pacific. An almost uncanny retaliation. The crew of the Essex, set adrift in open boats thousands of miles from land, suffered a horrific ordeal that included starvation and eventually cannibalism. That incident, with its dramatic image of a whale turning upon its hunters, later inspired Herman Melville's novel Moby Dick in 1851. Melville himself had served on a whaling ship in the 1840s and laced his novel with authentic details of whaling life. His book immortalized the jargon, the camaraderie, and the metaphysical awe experienced by the whaler in the open ocean. And we hear echoes of actual whalers in lines like, "I know not all that may be coming, but be what it will, I'll go to it laughing." And I love that. It's a bit of a mix of bravery and fatalism, don't you think? I suppose they were probably common among those who lowered boats into that abyss to do battles with those deep-sea leviathans. Duh. For all its cruelty, just imagine the adventure. You don't get that with jobs these days, don't you? No, you just don't. Well, anyway, for all its romance, the whaling industry at its height was ruthlessly extractive, and of course, extremely unsustainable. The evidence was visible, even to contemporary observers. Favored species of whales were becoming harder and harder to find. A whaling captain in the 1830s remarked that sperm whales had become as scarce as hen's teeth, lamenting the decline in sightings compared to earlier years. As local whale populations were wiped out, ships had to roam farther into unknown seas. Voyages lengthened, and sometimes yielded less oil than before. Whales themselves grew more weary and aggressive after decades of being hunted. Whales are actually quite intelligent. They learn after a while. Veteran whalers noted that previously docile right whales, for instance, had actually learned to avoid the slow oar-powered whaleboats, and some sperm whales, famously intelligent, seemed to adopt fighting tactics, such as charging and smashing boats, that they had not used in the earlier days. This notion that whales could learn to retaliate was enforced by dramatic events like the Essex disaster, and another example comes from the Arctic. English whaling captain William Scoresby Jr., writing in 1820, recounted one prodigious whale hunt, where a bowhead whale dragged his crew's boats for over 9 miles through ice-strewn waters, at one point sinking a pursuing boat, before finally succumbing. Brave effort, though, that's for sure. The whale had even run out nearly 6 miles of line in its desperate soundings, demonstrating that astonishing strength and tenacity was still left within it. Of course, stories like this, they were always spreading through the whaling ports, people coming back with these tales of survival, all interesting, perhaps a little bit embellished sometimes, but either way, it just adds to the lore of the whaling industry. That's what makes it so interesting, right? Well, whaling's influence extended beyond economics and labor, even into the realms of politics and diplomacy at its height. Major powers jockeyed not only for the whales themselves, but also for the strategic advantages that came with the whaling industry. Let's look at the case of Britain. As we saw, the government policy actively subsidized whaling both to hurt Dutch trade, but also to build a reserve of ships and men for the Royal Navy who already had their sea legs about them. And indeed, many whaling vessels and crews were later repurposed for military service during the Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812. In the United States, the federal government showed interest in protecting its whaling interests on the high seas. American whalers voyaging into the distant Pacific and the Arctic sometimes became unwitting emissaries of their country. U.S. naval expeditions in the mid-19th century often had whaling in mind. And there is quite a famous example, actually. Commodore Matthew Perry's mission to Japan, 1853, that was. Yes, the primary goal was to open Japanese ports to trade, but a significant impetus was the safety and logistical support of American whaling ships in the North Pacific. By the 1840s, dozens of American whalers each year were cruising off Japan and the nearby whaling grounds. Yet Japan's strict isolation policy made it hostile to foreign ships. Several shipwrecked whaling crews had been imprisoned or mistreated by Japanese authorities. Thus, President Millard Fillmore's instructions to Perry explicitly included to secure humane treatment for the shipwrecked American whalers and obtaining coaling and supply stations for the whaling ships in Japan. So when Perry forced the Treaty of Kanagawa on the Tokugawa shogunate in 1854, one of the treaty's provisions guaranteed assistance to shipwrecked sailors, essentially a diplomatic win for the industry of whaling. The, quote, opening of Japan, a momentous geopolitical event, was thus partly catalyzed and, set on by the practical needs of the whaling industries of New England operating in those waters. Whaling also played a role in the expansion of the American influence into the Pacific Islands. Hawaii, as mentioned, became a critical waypoint for the whaling fleet. The point that the Kingdom of Hawaii's economy in the 1830s and 50s was deeply entwined with provisioning and entertaining whalers. Many Hawaiians were employed in shipyards, as sailors, or in coastal trades due to whaling. The influx of thousands of foreign navalmen each year had complex effects on the society, of course, some detrimental. Let's just think of the main two. Disease, for one, alcohol, for the second. But of course, there was also some economic stimulation. It doesn't quite balance out, though, I'm afraid. Similarly, ports in Tahiti, the Marquesas, and later in Auckland and Honolulu were frequent harbors for refuge and repair for whaling ships. Even in areas as remote as the Okhotsk Sea in the Arctic, whaling ships were raising flags and carried the geopolitical aura of their home nations into uncharted waters, sometimes, of course, causing international disputes. Let's just look at one example. There were instances of American whalers operating near Russian Alaska, raising Russian suspicions, and clashes in the Western Arctic when British and American vessels converged on the same bowhead grounds in the 1850s and 60s. But perhaps surprisingly, whaling was also indirectly linked to convict transportation and colonization. In the 1780s, British whaling merchant families like the Enderbys were instrumental in lobbying for access to the Pacific. They even proposed that convict transports to Australia could double as whaling voyages, dropping off prisoners and then hunting whales before returning to make the trips financially viable. Well, this plan reflects how entangled whaling was with the imperial strategy at large. Later, British and French colonial authorities offered their own incentives. Just one, for example, the French government, after the Napoleonic Wars, tried to rebuild its whaling industry by subsidizing voyages from ports like Dunkirk. French whaling did revive briefly in the 1830s, with French ships venturing to Alaska and New Zealand waters. However, the French whaling effort never quite matched the scale of the UK and American enterprise, and by 1868, France ceased whaling. It was just unprofitable. But still, the attempt shows how nations saw whaling as part of their commerce, and even national prestige on a world stage. Socially and politically, back home, the whaling industry had a paradoxical character. You see, on one hand, it was a very rough business. It drew in the marginal and the adventurous. But on the other hand, its profits helped build the very refined and cosmopolitan communities. A city like New Bedford in the 1850s not only had docks and candle factories, but also fine mansions, libraries, and get this, even an opera house, all paid for by whale money. The Quaker merchants of New Bedford and Nantucket, known for their piety and thrift, paradoxically grew stupidly rich from a bloody and often impious trade. And while whaling was incredibly dangerous, as one observer quipped, all hands risked their lives for the sake of a barrel of oil, it was one of the few industries in the era where a person of color or a poor deckhand could, either through luck or merit, rise to command a ship and share in a lucrative lays, the profit-sharing system by which crews were paid. The whaling voyage was thus a microcosm of a democratic and yet hierarchical society. Every crewman had a lay, from the captain who might get 1/8 of the final take, to a green hand who might get 1/350th. All had a stake in success, though the shares were vastly unequal. As the 19th century marched on, clouds gathered on the industry's horizon. Long before the modern environmental movement, which, as we all know, would later object to whaling on more ethical grounds and environmental concerns, economic and technological changes had begun to undermine the industry. Things were beginning to fall apart. The decline of the great whaling boom was not a sudden collapse, however, but a rather steady erosion, noticeable by the 1860s, but undeniable by the 70s. So let's go through a few of the interrelated factors that contributed to this. Resource depletion, that was the foremost. Decades of intense hunting had drastically reduced populations of the most sought-after whales. The North Atlantic right whale had been driven nearly to commercial extinction by the mid-century. Sperm whales, too, had become scarce in the mid-Pacific, where they were once plentiful. A whaling voyage that in 1820 might return in under 2 years with full holds of oil were, by 1850, often 3 or 4 year odysseys, ranging further and yielding less. The industry's own chronicler, Alexander Starbuck, later noted that after the mid-1840s, quote, as whales became more scarce and voyages were more prolonged and far more expansive, these reverses became more and more serious for the American whaling fleet. Of course, profitability suffered. Ships had to spend more time and more money only to find fewer whales. By the late 1850s, American whaling statistics showed a clear downturn. The number of active whaling ships, which peaked around 735 in 1846, fell by 1860 to 400, and the total oil yield was dropping too. In 1845, U.S. whalers brought in over 430,000 barrels of whale and sperm oil combined. That's an all-time high. But thereafter yields declined sharply. Individual ports began to falter. Nantucket, once the pride of the whaling ports, saw its fleet dwindle in the 1850s. The island's sandbarred harbor could not accommodate larger modern ships, and after a disastrous fire in 1846, plus the decline of the nearby whales, Nantucket's whaling days seemed to be numbered. The final whaling voyage from Nantucket sailed in 1869, marking the end of over 200 years of the whaling tradition. New Bedford held on longer, but it too sent fewer ships as the century wore on. Well, then we have new energy sources and markets, and these perhaps dealt the most fatal blow. In 1859, just as whalers struggled with scarcity, a well in Titusville, Pennsylvania struck petroleum, heralding the dawn of the oil industry. Within a few years, cheap kerosene distilled from petroleum began to flood the market as an alternative to lamp fuel, and by the late 1860s, kerosene was abundantly available, not to mention far cheaper than whale oil. In 1845, whale oil, now a premium product, sold for around $1.30 to $2.50 a gallon, whereas new petroleum-based oil could be had for 50 cents a gallon. Doesn't make sense to buy the whale variety, doesn't it? Consumers quickly noticed the difference, of course. Even before kerosene became dominant, other substitutes were making inroads. Camphene, a turpentine alcohol blend, lard oil, and coal gas for lighting. They'd all chipped away at whale oil's market by the 1850s. And indeed, by 1860, whale oil was no longer the primary fuel for lamps in many cities. An IRS report in 1860 showed whale oil production at 18 million gallons annually, dwarfed by 90 million gallons of cheaper burning fluid such as camphene used per year. When the U.S. government during the Civil War taxed alcohol, making camphene expensive, and lightly taxed kerosene, it effectively cleared the path for kerosene to take over the lighting market. By the early 1870s, kerosene had largely displaced whale oil in American and European lamps. And this was a classic case of technological substitution. The entire industry and way of life was completely upended by a new source of energy. Whalers, well, they keenly felt the impact. One whaling captain, after returning home to find kerosene lamps common, reportedly muttered that, quote, John D. Rockefeller, the emerging oil magnate, has out-whaled us without ever leaving his desk. The decline in demand meant that even if whales had been abundant, the economic incentive was still shrinking. By 1870, a New Bedford whale ship might come home with a full cargo of oil and bone, only to find lukewarm prices at auction, a far cry from the frenzied bidding of decades earlier. Whales, once the lubricant and light of the world, if we can call it that, were now becoming economically obsolete. As a recent historian aptly put it, whalers lived through the transition from a world fueled mostly by organic energy to one run increasingly on fossil fuels, and that transition simply left them behind. And then there's one more factor: the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. That hastened the industry's contraction a bit more. You see, the war both distracted national focus and physically damaged the whaling fleet. Dozens of New England whale ships were laid up as the conflict began. The Union Navy, desperate to blockade the Confederate ports, even bought or commanded old whaling vessels and sank them to create obstacles. the so-called Stone Fleet. Confederate commerce raiders, like the CSS Alabama, prowled the seas and famously burned over a dozen Union whale ships, viewing them as easy and undefended targets. Between the Stone Fleet losses and the Confederate depredations, at least 50 whaling ships were destroyed during the war years. The manpower drain also mattered. Many New England mariners joined the Navy or Merchant Marine during the war, and whaling crews became hard to recruit. And by the war's end, the whaling fleet was a shadow of its former self, struggling to regroup in the face of meager profits. In the 1860s, even as traditional whaling waned, a new phase was dawning: mechanized whaling, led, however, by other nations. Ironically, it was in this declining period that the biggest technological leap in whaling since the try-works took place: the invention of the explosive harpoon cannon. Wow. Doesn't that sound like something? In 1864, a Norwegian sealer turned whaler, Sven Foyn, began experimenting with a mounted gun that could fire a harpoon with an explosive head. By 1870, Foyn had perfected the design: a heavy steel harpoon with a grenade that would detonate inside the whale, and mounted it on a steam-powered catcher boat. This innovation allowed the whalers to target the swift, powerful rorquals like blue whales and fin whales, which had mostly eluded the old sail and rowboat whaling era. Foyn's invention is often cited as the beginning of modern whaling, at least in a 20th century sense. Norway and other countries quickly adopted the technology in the 1870s and 80s to establish these new whaling industries in places like Iceland and the Antarctic waters, though these developments truly flourished in the early 20th century, beyond our period. For the old sailing whale ships of New England and Europe, however, the harpoon cannon had arrived too late. They could not easily retrofit steam engines into wooden hulls, nor could they compete with the efficiency of modern killers. But by the time electric lights began appearing in cities in the 1880s, the age of Yankee whale ships and Arctic whaling barks was well and truly over. The final chapters of pre-electric whaling were tinged with both nostalgia and tragedy. In the 1870s, as demand for whale oil collapsed, some whaling entrepreneurs kept going by focusing on baleen, which still commanded high prices for corsets and buggy whips. This led them to emphasize Arctic whaling for bowheads with their long baleen. A fleet of New Bedford and San Francisco ships continued to hunt in the Arctic each summer. But nature and fate dealt a cruel blow in 1871. It was in that year that a fleet of 33 American whaling ships, almost the entire Arctic fleet, became trapped in pack ice off the coast of Alaska when an early freeze-up occurred. Despite frantic efforts, the ice closed in, and the crews had to abandon all 33 ships. Over 1,200 officers and crew, including women and children from a few families, accompanied voyagers made a desperate trek in small boats to the few ships that had avoided entrapment further south. Well, miraculously, almost everyone was rescued, with fairly minimal loss of life. But the whaling fleet, that couldn't be saved. It was completely devastated. The ghostly sight of dozens of stout whale ships, crushed and forsaken in the ice. It was like a graveyard for the end of an era. Newspapers at the time heralded the whaling disaster of 1871, and saw it as a signal that the Arctic, and perhaps the industry itself, had finally exacted its price. Some whaling captains tried again in subsequent years, but another mass ice trappings in 1876 destroyed more vessels. It became clear that the economics were no longer favorable to justify the risks. And so, by the early 1880s, only a few dozen American whale ships were still sailing, down from hundreds a few decades earlier. As for Britain, it was pretty much the same. Their industry had dwindled. The last of the British whaling ships, operated out of Dundee and Peterhead for Arctic whales, gave up around this time as well. It was all just unprofitable. Other nations like the Netherlands and France had long since exited the stage. And then, a rather poetic end came in 1886, when the venerable ship Charles W. Morgan, today the last surviving 19th century whale ship, was laid up, ending her career after 37 years and multiple world-circling voyages. She would later become a museum ship, a relic of bygone glory days of sail whaling. And so, in the span of roughly 3 centuries, from the 16 to the 1800s, the whaling industry rose from scattered coastal hunts to a globe-straddling enterprise, and then crumbled into near obsolescence, all before the advent of electricity and modern environmentalism. At its height, whaling was the pillar of the pre-industrial economy. Whale oil lit homes, streets, lubricated factory machines, and I suppose you could even say it greased up the wheels of diplomacy from time to time, while whalebone and baleen-shaped fashions and everyday tools. By 1900, the once mighty fleets of wooden whale ships were mostly gone or converted to other trades. Only mechanized steam whaling would persist into the 20th century, targeting new species in new area. A second act of whaling history that would eventually provoke the conservation movements of the 20th century. And I don't know about you, but for me, I'm pretty stuck by the ingenuity and daring that it took to build such an industry, but also by the speed in which it was rendered redundant. Well, I suppose the story of the rise and fall of whaling is more than just a maritime adventure, but also a cautionary tale of how global industry can boom on the back of natural resources and then completely collapse at the whims of the market. Certainly invites one to marvel at the resilience and bravery of the whalers who lowered away into unknown seas, to acknowledge the central role that whaling played in economies of the past, but also to reflect on the impermanence of even the mightiest industries. In the end, as the last whale oil lamps were snuffed out by the bright electric bulbs, the world that had been lit by whales receded into history, leaving behind legends of deep-sea creatures and the intrepid men who hunted them, in a world that we've all now forgotten. Thank you so much for joining me. I told you we'd have a whale of a time, and whale, you're still here. So I suggest you should hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed it. Perhaps you are whaled off to sleep. I don't know. We are finished now. So let me read my little list right here. Hang on a minute. Where is it? There it is. The patrons and supporters. Here we go. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, the Gitmers, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfidnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Brian, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Nephthys, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Venita, Claire, Cortese, Carol, Robert, and Mary. Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me. And yeah, leave your thoughts in the comments. Interesting video. A little bit out of our usual purview on this channel, I know. But it's definitely fascinating, isn't it? It's a world that's not that far removed from us in terms of, well, chronological terms. But, oh, how different it was. Can hardly imagine. Well, that's why we're here. For videos like this. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all. And I will see you when you feel like returning. You know where I'll be. Farewell for now, and good night.